Great. Ambassador Mark Gregor, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So what's it been like being ambassador for Israel to the UK? What kind of reception do you think Israel gets in Britain?
So first of all, it's a really interesting time to be a foreign ambassador in the UK. I mean, with all the changes going on in and around Brexit, it's a historic period. It's also an interesting period, or a challenging period for Britain's Jewish community. And so it has, for me, been, so far, I think, more interesting than many other ambassadorial positions that I could have taken up.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate that. We're having a big problem in this country with anti-Semitism on the far left at the moment. Why do you think the far left has such a loathing for Israel? What's going on there?
I think there's something about political extremism that can attack conspiracy theories and negative stereotyping, and of course that leads into anti-Semitism. The far right does it, the far left, the extreme Islamists. You tend to get stereotypes about Jews and about Israel. For the far right, I mean, all the Jews are either Trotsky or George Soros. For the far left, all Jews are Rothschild and, so forth. And for the Islamists, we're the poisoners of wells and the perverters of children.
We can't win.
That's the interesting thing about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has survived. It's not by accident it's called the oldest hatred. It survived because it has the ability to mutate, to be relevant for every new generation. And who would have thought, yes, that in the second decade of the 21st century, that anti-Semitism would be a problem in a democratic, free country like Britain? It's really, it's sort of unthinkable in many ways.
Yeah, but my question is really the left, who are meant to be the champions of standing up for the little guy and for being against racism, how do they come to this position where they're so hostile towards the Jewish state? That's what I struggle to get my head around.
And it's also even more of a question if you consider that progressives in this country and around the world supported Zionism, supported Israel.
Well, exactly. So what happened?
It's a tough one. I mean, let's remember that in the past, I remember from reading my history, that when Israel was established in 1948, progressives, people on the left around the planet rejoiced. They saw the establishment of the State of Israel as an integral part of an agenda of making this world a better place, of correcting a historic injustice that the Jewish people, who had been downtrodden and dispersed and persecuted and faced atrocities, including genocide, that they had finally achieved equality among the nations. That was considered a good thing, part of a progressive agenda. And today on parts of the left, especially amongst the more extreme left, it's the opposite. That the whole idea that the Jews would want to be equal amongst the nations, the whole idea that Jewish people should have national self-determination, that's considered an abomination. It's ridiculous.
So what's going on there? I mean, from what I understand, the reason why they think this way is because they see the Jewish people or the Israeli state as being an imperial force. The basic underlying thing that because they always want to stand up for the little guy, they now no longer see the Jews, the Israeli state, as the little guy. They see the Jews as having basically stole the land. Why is that a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened in the founding of Israel?
It is a misunderstanding because anyone who knows the history knows that we had to fight for our independence in the final years of the mandate, against the British colonial power. So in many ways, the establishment of the State of Israel is the opposite of imperialism. It was an anti-imperialist struggle. I don't know why it's become so warped, but I do know this, that from the very beginning, parts of the radical left, going back a century or more, were infected also by the virus of anti-Semitism. One of the fathers of French socialism, Proudhon, a very important man, was anti-Semitic. In the Russian revolutionary movement, people like Bukhanin were anti-Semitic. So the whole idea that somehow because the left believes in equality, that it is automatically immune from anti-Semitism is unfortunately not true.
But the issue of the Jewish people stealing the land, they say, yes, we understand that the British controlled Palestine, but the issue is that there are lots of Arab people living there, and lots of Arabs got displaced. That's where they say Jews took the land, displaced Arabs. How do we deal with that issue when they point the finger at the Jewish people and say that's what you did?
First of all, it's based on a myth that we're somehow foreign in our own country. Anyone who denies the Jewish connection with the land of Israel denies historical reality. And to deny the Jewish people the right for self-determination and even part of their homeland is, I believe, to be anti-Semitic.
But what if they say, yeah, but that's from so long ago, your connection? It was thousands and thousands of years ago.
It's not so long ago. My father was born in Magdeburg, Germany in 1931. And we know what his generation of Jews went through without there being a Jewish state. Now, just think of it for a moment. If Israel would have achieved its independence, not in 1948, but in 1938, just a decade before, in historic terms, that's nothing. How many Jews could have been saved? Maybe not all, but many Jews could have been saved. Those people who believe the Jews do not have a right to national self-determination want to return the Jewish people to 1938. How can anyone seriously justify that position?
Well, some people on the left would say, look, I don't like where this leads me, but it's unfair. You displaced the people. Just because you have been persecuted doesn't mean you have a right to persecute other people. That's what they'd say.
But that's also a myth, because no one needed to be displaced. There was a partition proposal put on the table in the 1930s by the British, which our side accepted to negotiate. There was a second partition proposal put on the table by the UN in 1947. In both cases, the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish people would be given national self-determination, live and let live, one alongside the other. It wasn't the Zionist side, it wasn't the Jewish side that said no to those compromise proposals. The only reason there was a displacement of Palestinian Arabs in 1948 was precisely because the Palestinian leadership said no to a fair compromise, said no to live and let live. They said all or nothing. They launched a war. And so, in many ways, if the Palestinian people have gone through a difficult period, and they have, it's because of decisions made by their own leadership.
And some people say that Palestinian national identity is actually made up in the sense that it didn't exist before Israel was created. They didn't have a flag, they didn't have a sense of national identity. What do you think about that? Do you think, well, maybe that's the case, but now they do have one? Or do you think in some ways it was contrived purely just to destabilize the Jewish state?
I think if one looks at the history of the Arab national movement, one knows that a few decades ago, Pan-Arabism was the genre. That Arabs did not see themselves not as Iraqis or Syrians or Egyptians or Palestinians, but they saw themselves as one Arab people. In many ways, Nasser in Egypt represented that phenomenon, but it's also part of Ba'athist ideology and other Arab nationalist ideologies. In recent years, Pan-Arabism has sort of gone by the wayside, and different Arab peoples are asserting their own individual identity. And I think you see the growth of a particular Palestinian nationalism also as a function of that. There's no doubt that today, Palestinian Arabs see themselves as a people and they have national aspirations.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. People today say that the settlements are one of the biggest barriers to peace, and that if that's something that Israel kind of slowed down, or maybe even left, they left the settlements that exist in, whether you call it the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, that would be something that could help to move the peace process along. What do you say to that?
So it's clear when we negotiate peace with the Palestinians, the settlements is one of the issues we have to discuss. But it is wrong when people put the settlement issue on the pedestal and they say that is the be-all and end-all, or that is the reason we don't have peace. That position just doesn't stand up to the most elementary examination. Why? First of all, if that was true, why did we not have peace before 1967? I mean, if it's all about the settlements that we built since 1967, so obviously before 67 there wasn't a problem and Israelis and Arabs lived in peace, when that is clearly not the case. In fact, the Arab-Israel conflict predates 67 by almost half a century, if not longer. The second question is, if you use this logic that it's all about the settlements, you know, Israel's most peaceful border must be our border with Gaza, because there Israel took down all the settlements just over a decade ago. The settlers who didn't want to leave voluntarily, the Israeli police came in and took them out. There's not a single settlement in Gaza. So explain to me today, if the cause of the conflict is the settlements, why our border with Gaza is not the most peaceful, stable, and quiet border of any of Israel's borders? And the answer is, it's clearly not only about the settlements.
That kind of, if you think about that and think about the fact that before 67 there were no settlements and there was still this conflict.
Unless in the eyes of our neighbors, Tel Aviv is a settlement,
Well,
Haifa is a settlement, Ramla is a settlement. In fact, if Israel, all of Israel is illegitimate, if all of Israel is a foreign creation, if all of Israel should be destroyed, then of course that's a logical position from their perspective, but it of course means that they don't want peace and reconciliation with us.
yeah, and I was going to say, isn't that then cause for despair? If we can't even, even if you think about it, before the settlements, there was this conflict still raging against Israel. Where is there room for hope in that there's going to be reconciliation?
So I'm happy to tell you that there is hope.
Oh, good.
And that hope comes from Israel's new relations with the Arab states. We have peace treaties with two of our most important neighbors, with Egypt, the largest Arab country, and with the Kingdom of Jordan, which is our longest border with any country is with Jordan. But we're talking today to more Arab countries than ever before. I mean, that's a very important sentence. Israel is talking today with more Arab governments than ever before since the creation of the Jewish state.
Why is that happening?
Well, we're seeing a convergence of interests between us and the Arab states, where more and more Arab governments understand that Israel doesn't threaten them. On the contrary, the same forces that threaten the Arab states threaten Israel, and by working together, we can meet those challenges more effectively.
What kind of forces?
Well, if you're an Arab government and you look at the threats against your security, against your stability, against your prosperity, it's clear they come from extreme Islamist groups, whether it's the extremist Sunnis, groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or the extreme Sunni Shia, which are represented by Iran and Hezbollah and so forth. But the same groups that they perceive as threatening them threaten us. And we have seen now this moving together of Israel and a whole group of Arab states. And for us, it's very exciting because countries that used to see us as their enemy are seeing us today as an ally and a partner. And these new relationships in the Arab world are very encouraging. Once again, it's not happening with one or two Arab countries, it's happening across the region. And it's good for the region, it's good for regional cooperation, it's good for peace, and ultimately, I believe, in the medium and longer term, it has to help us with the Palestinians too.
Well, it's interesting. Well, perhaps in that sense, that we're seeing more solidarity towards the Palestinian cause outside of the Arab world than in the Arab world, in some senses. Because you find a lot of solidarity with the Palestinian cause today on campuses, on Western campuses.
But are they really friends of the Palestinians? Because the sort of things that I've encountered here in the UK since arriving here over 3 years ago, people who claim to be friends of the Palestinians, who wave Palestinian flags and speak out against Israel, are they really friends of the Palestinians? Because I think if you actually look at their agenda, it's a very maximalist agenda, very extreme agenda. They shout and they sing, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Their words, correct?
Yeah.
So they're telling the Palestinian people, don't compromise, you will defeat Israel. In other words, they're telling the Palestinian people to repeat the mistakes of the 1930s, to repeat the mistakes of the 1940s when they rejected partition, to hold out firm, stick to us, maximalist position. You never have to compromise with Israel. You should never compromise with Israel because Israel is, in their words, evil. Are they not, by selling the Palestinian people this very damaged agenda, yes? Are they not condemning the Palestinian people to the status quo? Because in fact, they're selling them a myth that they're somehow going to defeat Israel. They're not going to defeat Israel. Is there any evidence whatsoever that Israel is weaker today than it was 70 years ago? The opposite is true. Economically, politically, militarily, Israel is there to stay. By telling the Palestinians they can have it all, they're doing the Palestinians harm. They're no friends of the Palestinian people.
That's a very powerful shift in perspective, and perhaps that point needs to be made more clearly on campuses. Compromise and seeking peace needs to be the message of the day on campuses, I think. I was actually just watching yesterday a debate produced by an organisation called Intelligence Squared. They produce lots of debates in the UK. And the debate was on, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And on the on opposition, saying that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, was Ilan Pappé and Mehdi Hasan. And Mehdi Hasan said that his solution to, and Ilan Pappé as well, I believe, concurred, was that his solution to the situation between Israel and the Palestinians was to have one state. And that would be his ultimate compromise, a state for Arabs and Jews. But that would, of course, mean that it's no longer a Jewish majority state. What do you think about that position? And is that position, I believe, to be anti-Semitic? Because it's basically saying the Jewish people can't have a homeland where they can live in security.
First of all, I agree with you. Because to support people's right to national self-determination and say everyone has the right to self-determination, but to deny the Jews that right, is to say the Jews aren't entitled to what every other people has. The right, you deny them that right. That's very problematic. But on the larger point, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? I think there are three clear reasons that show that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There's statistical evidence, there's empirical evidence, and there's the substantive proof. The statistical evidence is clear that when you do research of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist activists, and the Jewish Policy Research Group here in London has done extensive research, and they've found a clear statistical correlation between anti-Israel attitudes and anti-Semitic attitudes. And if you are a mild anti-Israel activist, chances are, according to the statistics, you will be a mild anti-Semite. And guess what? If you're an extreme anti-Israel activist, guess what? Chances are there's a clear statistical correlation that you will be an extreme anti-Semite. So there's a clear statistical correlation that can't be ignored.
Yeah.
The second point, empirical. When one discovers these Palestinian social media groups on Facebook or in other places, and they're exposed to the general public, one finds them awash with anti-Semitic stereotypes, with Holocaust denial, with conspiracy theories. Why are they there? In other words, every time one of these groups is exposed, we find all this filth, this hate speech. Is it accidental? So there is also empirical evidence. And finally, is what we spoke about before, the substantive connection. The same people who deny my people's rights to self-determination champion everyone else's, whether it's the Palestinians or the Iraqis or other peoples around the world. But when you champion national self-determination for everyone, except for the Jews, what's that all about?
Yeah. And especially when people often would claim to be, people that support anti-Zionism claim to be anti-nationalists, yet they're supporting the Palestinian nationalist cause.
100%. Why is it that these people, in their perspective, the Palestinians have a right to national self-determination, but the Jews don't? What's that all about? Once again, they're telling the Jews to go back to when my father was born in the 1930s. That's what they're telling the Jews. That the Jews should be denied the right of equality among the nations, that the Jews should be denied the right to be able to protect themselves as a collective, that the Jews should be condemned to once again return to a situation of being a discriminated minority facing threats that no other people over history has faced.
And I've often said that when they say Israel has no right to exist, they really mean the Jews have no right to exist.
I think we've already said very clearly that there is a clear connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in fact, you could say, I believe that anti-Zionism is just a modern manifestation of this old hatred that has the ability to change, to be relevant in different generations. Instead of hating the individual Jew, you hate the collective Jew, which is today the state of Israel.
So when the Labour Party recently came out with a guide on anti-Semitism, and they said clearly, being an anti-Zionist does not mean that you're necessarily engaging in anti-Semitism. From what we said, you would fundamentally disagree with that.
I believe that anti-Zionism is a modern manifestation of anti-Semitism, and I believe there is very, very strong arguments behind that determination. It's based on fact. Once again, to call for the destruction of Israel is to return the Jews to the 1930s. You know, I'd say this. It's very easy for people to feel sympathy with the persecuted Jew. You know, there's that famous picture of the young boy in the Warsaw Ghetto holding his hands up, and every person can feel sympathy and empathy for that poor Jewish child. But what if the modern Jew has decided he doesn't want to be a victim anymore? If the modern Jew has decided he doesn't want to be the persecuted minority, that he wants to be sovereign and free and independent in his homeland, at peace with his neighbors too, preferably. But will you still have empathy for us then? Or it's only if we're suffering in a persecuted minority, only then will you have empathy for us? Well, we have chosen, as a people, to exercise our right of national self-determination and to be free and independent, and we'll keep it that way. And anyone who believes that Israel is going to be destroyed, or anyone who believes that they can tell the Palestinians, you will win, it's not true. You are hurting the Palestinians because you're selling them a false bill of goods.
Someone once said that Europe never forgave the Jews for the Holocaust, and that Israel is the sort of the perfect answer to allowing some Europeans to shelve their guilt by now pointing the finger and saying, you're the real Nazis. And exactly as you're saying, instead of feeling bad for the poor persecuted Jew, being able to have the chance to say, no, the strong, powerful, dominant Jew, you are the guilty ones. I think, as you're saying, clearly the real test for whether you respect Jews as equals is whether you can have support for them when they are strong and when they can defend themselves. I think that's exactly what you're saying.
Agreed.
Yeah. So finally, I just want to switch gears for a second and talk about Jerusalem. Some people who even support Israel say that America recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was unnecessary because it doesn't achieve much and only increase tensions. What would you say to that?
Not true. Recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital is the right thing to do. It's good for peace. And I encourage others to do it. I encourage the British government to do it too.
Why is it good for peace?
Because there won't be peace without Jerusalem being Israel's capital. And by putting it there up front, you're helping to erode a myth on some parts on the other side that somehow the Jews are going to be thrown out of Jerusalem. Once again, there won't be peace without Jerusalem being Israel's capital, and we might as well say that now, loud and clear. You know, according to the logic of some of Israel's critics, they say everything over the 67 border is illegitimate, or everything over the 67 border is open for negotiation. Okay, so the logic is that everything inside the 67 border is Israel proper. Well, Jerusalem's been Israel's capital since the very beginning. What's the problem with recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital?
Well, they say because at the beginning it was proposed by the UN to be divided between East and West, Jews and Arabs.
So even if you don't accept Israel's position that Jerusalem must remain the united capital of Israel, why can you not accept what was pre-67 as Israel's capital? What's wrong with that? You know, every country on this planet has the right to choose its own capital. We've even have situations where countries have moved their capitals and the international community respects their right to change capitals, whether it was Turkey or Germany or Brazil. That's an international norm. Every country has the right to choose its own capital, and the other members of the international community respect that right. That is a right applied universally, but only denied to my country. Why?
So if countries started to recognize, let's say, West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, would you say that's a positive step in the right direction?
I would say people who recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, they are doing the right thing. They are recognizing, first of all, reality, because that's where our parliament is, that's where our judiciary is, that's where our executive branch sits. When British leaders, when French leaders, when German leaders come to Israel to meet Israeli leaders, where do those meetings take place? In Jerusalem. So recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital is to recognize reality.
But all of Jerusalem?
Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people for some 3,000 years. It's been the capital of the modern state of Israel for more than 70 years. It's time the international community accepted a fundamental truth, and there will be no peace without recognizing that reality. And the truth is, if you looked at reaction in the Arab world to the American decision to move the embassy, it was actually very measured. Because the Arabs know, too, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and will always be so.
What did you think about the media doing a split screen between the embassy opening and the riots taking place in Gaza?
So if you listened to the perpetrators of the violence in Gaza, Hamas, it was nothing to do with Jerusalem. They said it was all about this march of return. It was about other issues. They didn't talk about Jerusalem.
So was that irresponsible of the media?
I think it was incorrect. Frankly, incorrect to make that comparison. It happened on the same day, but in many ways that was by accident.
I presume you would therefore implore Britain to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Do you think that's on the horizon?
I will say now on television in front of you, I believe the British should move their embassy to Jerusalem. I think that would be the right thing to do. I think that would be the just thing to do. And I think ultimately that would be good for peace too.
Are you hopeful that it's going to happen?
I'll keep working on it.
Okay, great. And finally, just a lot of our viewers are young. Many of them are on college campuses around the world. Some are Jewish, some are not Jewish, but most of them are supportive of Israel. What would be your message to them? What do you think should be their main message to other students, to people they're trying to influence on campuses and as they go out into the wider world?
That Israel's cause is just. But if one looks at the revolutions of the 20th century, the most successful is the Zionist revolution, where a people that was oppressed, discriminated against, suffered persecution like no other, had a historic national rebirth in our homeland. And that today, Israel is not without fault, but we've built a multi-party democracy. 2 elections in 1 year is an attribute to that, with a free press, an independent judiciary. We're a progressive country. We had a female prime minister, a woman in our top job, 10 years before Margaret Thatcher was elected here. We're a country which is pluralistic, tolerant, and open. I think one of the largest gay pride marches on the planet happens in Israel. For all these reasons, I think we can be proud of Israel. And people should be proud of Israel's achievement. And we've done all those achievements in the face of adversity, in the face of a neighborhood that didn't welcome us home. And that's also changing for the better. As I said, we've got more and more communication, more and more connection, stronger relations than ever before with our Arab neighbors. And I believe the trajectory we are on is ultimately a positive trajectory.
Ambassador Mark Regev, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure for having me. Thank you.
Appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.